So I've just received a summary of the CAL FIRE report about an hour ago, and although I do not have the actual reports, I have a summary. In my opinion, the summary that I received is a wholesale indictment of the failures of PG&E's risk management practices across the board. And I don't say that lightly. But the report indicates that 8 out of these 12 fires all involve violations of state law dealing with tree trimming practices, the failure to maintain trees a sufficient distance from distribution lines so they do not pose a hazard. Other than those, we still have PG&E's equipment being pointed out as failing. And by that, what I mean is power poles that fractured. What I mean by that is distribution lines that separated from conductors. What I mean by that is lines that were down, distribution lines, that sparked a fire after they were de-energized, which is an indictment of PG&E's failed practices or policies or the lack thereof in having a policy to deactivate reclosers or de-energize lines. What we have here, in my view, are the nominal causes of how these fires started. But the real issue in my mind, and the real work at this point in time, is now examining all the decisions, all the executives and managers of PG&E and their failure to properly manage these risks, because every one of these is a foreseeable risk that could have been prevented by sound risk management practices. Sound practices with inspections to make sure that trees that pose hazards to distribution lines are properly maintained so they don't pose a fire hazard. They raise questions as to whether or not the individuals who are required to go out and inspect are properly trained or properly qualified to do their job. They raise questions in terms of whether or not budgets were properly funded to make sure that the inspections comported with state laws. They raise questions about whether or not there was effective management to make sure that inspections of the electrical distribution lines, whether they were maintained adequately so that you don't have lines that separate from conductors. They raise questions as to why it is that power poles fracture and break, and whether or not they were being adequately inspected and adequately maintained. They raise questions as to why it was that reclosers, devices that re-energize lines when they sense a fault, were left activated and not deactivated, as is done by San Diego Gas and Electric, and the lessons that were learned in 2007 when San Diego Gas and Electric did a wholesale revamping of their process and instituted policies, practices, and procedures that, in light of warnings where you have extreme fire danger and high winds, which was the case here, that PG&E had access to days before, why it was they had no policy or practice to deactivate reclosers or de-energize lines to prevent these kinds of catastrophic events from occurring. So, as far as I'm concerned, this work is by no means done. This work has only begun, because the real work now is to understand what the decisions were on why it was that these things were not done. And it's not the nice little people that we see in the blue and white trucks that are the problem. It is the people who are in charge of risk management, the corporate officers and the directors who set the culture for PG&E, that we want to investigate why it was that they didn't have risk management practices to prevent these very foreseeable risks from occurring. These are not isolated incidents. Let's make no mistake about this. This isn't just one time. This company has had 3 catastrophic events in 7 years. It started with the San Bruno pipeline disaster, where they were indicted by the NTSB and indicted by the CPUC regarding their safety culture. It happened again with the Butte fire and the failure to have or implement proper standards, practices, and procedures for inspections that caused a wildfire that took 70,000 acres in the Butte fire, Calaveras County, and some 500 homes that were destroyed. And now, out of 16 reports that have been issued, we see 11 where CAL FIRE has concluded that there were violations of state law. And the others still involve PG&E equipment and infrastructure, or failed policies and practices. So the work has just begun. This is a start, but there's a lot of heavy lifting left to do, because frankly, I am sick and tired of having to console people who have lost loved ones and lost homes because of failed management practices by PG&E.
Have you spoke with any of your clients? Have you had any reaction to them after they've heard that this is maybe something that maybe could have been prevented, or hearing that PG&E was at fault?
Well, regrettably, since the report was just issued at 4 o'clock, and the lateness in the day in which it was issued, I really haven't had the time to get on and call some of the people, particularly those who've lost loved ones, and I know who must be heartsick over, learning about what happened here, because they had loved ones who would be with us today, but for the fact that we've had a wholesale failure of risk management by PG&E. So I just haven't had a chance to get there yet. I do have Frank Jordan on the line, former mayor. Although he wasn't a victim of the fires that are part of this report, he did lose everything that he had in the Tubbs fire. That's the one report that's missing so far, and I know you may have a few comments at the end. I also have Steve Campora. Steve, is there anything you'd add?
Well, Frank, I have just seen PG&E's response to this report, and of course they're referencing what they call the new normal, and in fact what these reports demonstrate is it's the old normal. It's PG&E failing to operate their system safely. Which has nothing to do with what they want to call the new normal.
Yeah, what Steve has indicated is that PG&E's response is that this is part of a new normal, that somehow or other they're the victim of climate change. Well, I got news for PG&E. Climate change and the problems associated with climate change have been well known to all the utilities for at least a decade. Now, when you think about it, San Diego Gas and Electric, they face the same climate change challenges as PG&E. In 2007, they had a devastating wildfire. And they learned that in the face of high wind warnings and in extreme fire danger season, that the way that you combat, mitigate, and prevent a catastrophic event is you deactivate reclosers, those devices that re-energize lines after a fault. You de-energize lines. Now consider this experience. Since 2007, they've had not a single catastrophic event. So, climate change, the new normal, is not an excuse. It's a scapegoat by management because they need to blame something. So, they'll blame the new normal. But the new normal is a fact. The new normal is something you can prevent, and PG&E here failed the citizens of the state of California when it came to prevention for these wildfires.
PG&E made claims against
Pitre, will you have to wait until the DAs decide what to do with any potential criminal charges before the civil cases can proceed?
But I know that they're reviewing reports, and at least the reports that relate to those fires that have been referred to the DA have been withheld, so I will not have access to those reports. Just a little bit of the experience from San Bruno. Remember, in San Bruno, PG&E was convicted of 6 felonies. Now, during the pursuit of the civil cases, they did not seek to stay pursuit of the civil cases while the Department of Justice and the state attorneys general were investigating their conduct for criminal violations. So I'm hopeful that they don't use that as an excuse not to provide information or witnesses regarding what happened. You had a question?
Yes,
I'm sorry.
PG&E has suggested that this is actually the fault of local government, poor code enforcement with regard to vegetation, poor urban planning, too much density in places like Fountain Grove, lack of water. So that seems to be a direction that they're moving.
Yeah, those are all poor excuses when it comes to risk management, okay? The obligations are at the forefront. The forefront here in the beginning is proper inspection and practices to make sure that people are properly trained and qualified to identify hazard trees. The obligation at the forefront here is to make sure they've properly inspected their equipment to make sure that it's safe and isn't going to rip apart like a conductor from a distribution line. The process here is to make sure you have policies, practices, and procedure in place to mitigate the risk of a foreseeable harm. That's the failure on the front end. What they're referring to is if I choose to live in an area where there are trees around, that somehow or other I should be at fault because I've chosen to live in a serene area rather than an urban environment, that's blame shifting. That's classic PG&E. Shift blame. Blame public entities because they didn't warn residents. Well, you know what it took to have to warn these residents? They couldn't get the warnings out because a lot of the electrical power was out. There was difficulty getting any warnings out because there was a massive communication that was coming in and they couldn't get warnings out. This all starts and ends on the front end. Prevention. And I think it's despicable that they're blaming others for what is clearly their responsibility on the front end.
Can you touch on this? You started to a little bit about violating state law. So how you understand it, can you explain how you think they have?
Sure. State laws, and this is what they call a non-delegable duty, so you can't take that responsibility and shove it over on somebody else's plate. They have a responsibility to inspect trees and vegetation that are hazardous. And there are certain state laws that require that any tree or limb or branch that is within a certain distance of a distribution line have to be trimmed back with the anticipation that that tree or vegetation is going to grow. So they have sophisticated ways of doing that. It's not just people on the ground who look up and try to measure trees and their distance. They claim that they have aerial patrols, planes that fly overhead, and through the use of LIDAR can identify trees that are hazards or are a danger to their distribution lines. Okay? So they have access to aerial patrols and ground patrols that identify hazardous trees. But here's the problem that we found out when we got into the Butte fire. All those nice aerial patrols, they take wonderful pictures months before the Butte fire happened, but they didn't download them and analyze them until after the Butte fire occurred. So they had them in their possession for months, never evaluated them, and had they evaluated them, they would have found out that the tree that contacted the power line in the Butte case was a hazard. They failed. In the Butte case, they claimed they had ground patrols, people who were properly trained and qualified to identify trees that were hazards, diseased, weak, species that were prone to failure. But yet, when we got into it and we did what I call the hard work of asking people questions at a deposition, you found that people were not properly trained. And some of the people that were out there that had qualifications as dog groomers. So how can this be? This is a company that repeatedly has policies and procedures stacked up like phone books. but they either don't adhere to them, they ignore them, or they come up with exceptions not to do them.
So you're saying if there's a Mother Nature defense, if winds were 70 miles an hour and tree limbs were blown in, you're saying you're not afraid that that doesn't hold to you because they are responsible for anything that could possibly be blown into a power plant.
Well, the Mother Nature or act of God defense is usually something that is unforeseeable. A meteor that falls out of the sky and knocks down a power pole. This was not a meteor out of the sky. The wind conditions here were wind conditions that had been forecast days before. They knew the winds were coming. They knew the force of the winds that were coming. They knew the location of the winds that were coming. They had the ability to deactivate reclosers. They had the ability to de-energize lines. They did not. So the Mother Nature defense doesn't, in my view, in today's day and age, with sophisticated meteorology data, with sophisticated means to predict, and with the ability and means to eliminate the risk on the front end, that to me, when they use Mother Nature, that's an excuse. Steve, did you have any comment on that?
Well, that's exactly right, Frank. They knew everything that was going to happen was forecast before it happened, and they chose not to take. They've chosen at all times not to take the steps necessary to protect the public.
Khaldun, do you have anything you'd like to add there? I don't hear him.
And are any of your clients from these fires, or are all yours in the tubs? Or
No, we have clients that are in all fires. Okay, I'm working with a group of lawyers who represent folks that are in all of the fires. Really, it was the inability, given the lateness of the day that the report was issued, to be able to get hold of them so that they could comment on some of this.
And can you update us on, for some of us who are to catch us up, where your lawsuits are at, or if you have officially filed lawsuits
Yes.
against PG? Could you just run me through that real quick?
Yes, there's dozens of lawsuits that have already been filed. The court has established, first of all the lawsuits are pending in the San Francisco Superior Court in front of a Judge Carnell. It took a while for us to develop a procedure because we expect that there will be hundreds more lawsuits that will be following on. So we tried to devise a process that was simple for people to add their case to the existing cases. And as those cases are in process, we have already begun what we call the formal process of investigation, which is called discovery, where we are able to request that documents from PG&E be provided to us for review so that we can come to a better understanding of the organizational methods that they use to assess risks and to mitigate those risks, and then to determine whether or not those policies, practices, and procedures were actually followed here, and if not, why not? So that's just starting.
It's worth the beginning.
When do you expect the investigation on the
Frank?
tubs?
What, Steve, go ahead.
Right?
Yes.
You know, there's one thing. In May of 2015, PG&E submitted to the California Public Utilities Commission their rate case, and in that rate case, and talking about risk assessment, they said they were expecting that up to 2% of the trees would be in contact with lines. And they knew that there would be fires as a result of that. And they knew that they could reduce the risk further by increasing the amount of money they spent on vegetation, but they chose not to do that.
It's a really important point. That's the concept of budgets and money and the failure to allocate their budgets to what they told the CPUC they would do.
That request was at a rate hike hearing?
Or a rate case. The way it works with PG&E is that each year PG&E goes to the CPUC, and what they need to do is justify a rate increase or the rate that they're going to charge.
Was it granted?
Steve, the question is, was it granted?
It was part of the rate case, and as part of their rate case, they were talking about their risk management program. And in that risk management program, they were talking about the trade-off of accepting this risk versus spending more money. It wasn't a request for additional funds. It was them saying that they weren't going to spend any more money on vegetation management.
But did they get the money? Did they get the rate hike?
It was the 2017, the rate case is filed in a 3-year period, so they filed it in 15, and part of their normal rate case, it was part of their normal rate case presentation.
Yeah, what Sergio,
2015 applies to 15, 16, and 17.
what Sergio wants to.
Their rate was approved.
Oh,
Their
okay.
rate was
There
approved,
you go.
whether it's dollar for dollar, but that wasn't a specific request for additional money. It was them saying they didn't want to spend more money on vegetation management, even though they knew they could reduce the risk further.
Frank Jordan on the line.
I
Mayor-
can provide that paper to anybody who wants it.
Yeah. Mayor Jordan, are you on the line?
Yes, I am. I'm standing by. Good evening.
Yeah, we do. So, Mayor, I know that a lot of people here want to know your reaction, at least to the most recent report that was issued, given the fact that you've went through a horrible tragedy yourself in the Tubbs fire.
Well, I have been following this for the last 8 months, and unfortunately, I wish I could be there today. I have to be in Montana on business, but I'm delighted to have the opportunity at least to express my comments. I'm not surprised when I see now that the CAL FIRE reports that came out today, 12 of them that 8 show PG&E equipment directly responsible for the fires, and the other 4 partially responsible. And what's been bothering me is I've been watching all along PG&E holding these meetings up in the state legislature in Sacramento, lobbying to change California liability laws. I don't know why they would do that if they didn't feel like they were responsible for something. What they're doing is attempting to avoid any financial responsibility for these devastating fires, both in Napa and Sonoma County and elsewhere. But you heard it earlier, these excuses, climate change and Mother Nature's unpredictability. Well, I think that when you look at CAL FIRE coming out and coming up with the facts, just all we have been asking for is just give us the facts as they see them and not hide behind some issue of global warming. So I am very anxious to stay on top of this because we expect professional accountability and not secret agendas to avoid responsibility and accountability from PG&E. I've been watching closely, and I have been in public service for over 50 years, and I know what it's like to be accountable to the public and to take responsibility and accountability, and I'm seeing them walk away from their accountability. They're leaving the taxpayers to pay the bill if they can, and that's not what PG&E should be all about. They should be owning up to what happened and doing what they can. You know, their PG&E logo, it said, and I've listened to it 3 or 4 times at their public relations lately, together building a better California. They better think about together rebuilding a better California because they are directly responsible for some of these devastating fires that have happened, and they've got to take responsibility for them. I am frustrated. Yes, I'm a victim, but I'm more really feeling and this is the management, the leadership, and the board. I'm talking about them, the rank and file, the line of people who are out there helping to reestablish lines and clearing transformers and doing all they can have given us a sense of hope and positive feelings. But it's the management and the top echelon that are avoiding their responsibility, and it came out today to show us exactly where we are.
Well said, Mayor.
I am curious. There has been talk in some of these conversations and going to California to the legislature. You know, their concern or their complaint is that they could be potentially bankrupted over potential liability to this. How accurate or how truthful do you think that concern for the company is? The prospect of PG&E being bankrupted over potential liability for these fires.
Well, I think it's once again, it's a fear tactic. It's manufactured. This is a $23 billion company. And even if you look at the conservative estimates that have been put out in the Wall Street Journal and some of the other news articles lately, they're talking about a potential $12 billion hit. And even Wall Street has concluded, yeah, it might be a little painful, but it's not bankruptcy. So, you know, look, I think it's sad when somebody tries to manufacture the claim of bankruptcy, to cry, to be able to get out of jail free card, because it's going to hurt shareholders, that somehow or other we should give them a free pass. and shift the burden of the cost of these catastrophic events to taxpayers, ratepayers, and the victims who are trying to build themselves out from under the rubble. I think it's shameful. You stand up like everybody else, and when you do wrong, you take accountability for it, and you make it right. You don't run to the legislature and say, absolve me, so I don't have any responsibility at all for what's going on. And what probably throws salt into the wounds is that PG&E is the one who is blaming others, blaming folks for having built in areas where these fires happen, blaming public entities because they didn't warn people and give them enough warning under these crisis circumstances. They're the ones who are asserting blame against others. They're the ones who want to take advantage of the principles of fault, but when it comes to them, they want to be shielded. It's a double standard.
And Frank, also, I'd like to say, too, that they are definitely now, based on what CAL FIRE reports are saying, they're in violation of state safety laws. And that, to me, is unconscionable, especially when you have death involved here. How do you feel about the families now that hear this today, and knowing that PG is up in Sacramento trying to advocate their responsibility? What kind of a responsibility organization is PG&E going to be looking like from this point on? It's amazing, but it's shameful, too, as well.
Thank you, Mayor. Any other questions? Are we okay?
I think I'm good.
Okay, everybody. I appreciate very much Steve, Mayor Jordan. I appreciate the press coming out. This is an important issue. It's important to all of us, and I thank you for your attention.
This was at
Thank you.
Tubbs.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was at his fire, at the Tubbs fire. Yeah. He told me when he talked to me that the next morning that new washers and dryer melted, couldn't even find them.
Sorry,
They
we
drove
had to
out,
have
they
this
went and knocked
at this
on
late
all the
hour, and everybody
doors.
wants to go to the Warriors game and not have to hit the traffic, so
Me and
I
Wendy knocked
apologize.
on all the doors, and they
Pardon?
barely got out
Mayor,
driving
former
through the
Mayor
fires.
of City and County of San Francisco,
Oh, it's
Frank Jordan.
Sorry.
Yeah.